1,000 years the servant of man. What is it? Whence does it come? This is the story of sulfur. Sulfur, yellow mineral without which there would be no automobiles, no airplanes, no newspapers, no motion pictures, no telephones. None of the new wonder drugs, sulfur drugs, so dramatically combating once fatal diseases. The United States produces over 80% of the world's output of crude sulfur. Most of it comes from great salt domes along the Gulf of Mexico, in Louisiana and Texas. From New Orleans to a point south of Houston and down toward Galveston is the great sulfur-producing area. 7 distinct sulfur mines in this region produce a total of 3.5 million gross tons annually. This quantity would make a 70 million cubic foot block of sulfur, almost twice as large as the Empire State Building, rising over 1,000 feet into the air. And great salt domes such as this, with the sulfur-bearing strata shown in cross-section, are about 1,000 feet beneath the surface of the coastal plains. The modern method of mining sulfur as a liquid was conceived and developed by Dr. Herman Fresh in the 1890s. The mineral is melted underground by superheated water and pumped to the surface through pipes. A well such as this is drilled by the most modern equipment to the sulfur-bearing bed and equipped with pipes of 3 sizes, one within the other. Down through the large outer 6-inch pipe, superheated water, 300 to 330 degrees Fahrenheit, flows to melt the sulfur. The melted sulfur rises to the surface through the 3-inch middle pipe, driven upward by the compressed air, which is forced into the well through the small 1-inch pipe. For the fresh method of sulfur mining, then, the prime requisites are compressed air, fuel, and millions of gallons of water. Here on the shore of a peaceful stream stands a pump house, which collects the water necessary for mining sulfur. The water goes to this great reservoir, which covers nearly 300 acres and holds about 1 billion gallons of water. Through this outlet, river pumps discharge 40,000 gallons each minute into the reservoir. Then, through underground conduits, the water flows to the power plant. Huge water softeners are just outside the power plant. The water is conditioned in these to make it suitable for use in the steam boilers and heaters. The power plant itself houses the most modern equipment, furnishing electric energy for all operations. Through this mammoth switchboard, energy is distributed to the plant and out to the field several miles away. Four tons of steam are generated every minute in the boiler room to heat the millions of gallons of water required in the mining operations. To avoid any possibility of a break in the hot water supply, the power plant is equipped to utilize oil fuel if the natural gas supply should be interrupted. After being softened and conditioned, the water flows into these heaters. They can deliver 9 million gallons of water at 330 degrees Fahrenheit every 24 hours. The superheated water flows directly to the field through this great pipe system. Under pressure from these 65 centrifugal pumps, which provide a continuous supply of hot water. Without hot water, production would stop. Now let's see what actually happens to the water in the power plant. The water tube boiler generates steam at 100 pounds pressure. Some of this steam operates turbines that generate the electric power required in the plant itself. But most of the steam is used directly for heating the water. The heater is a large jet condenser which employs the latent heat of the steam to heat the water. Over 4 pounds of water are heated for every pound of steam generated. In these great compressors, air is being compressed while the water is being softened and heated. Each day, these machines compress over 1.5 million cubic feet of air to a pressure of 500 pounds per square inch. Then, superheated water, compressed air, and steam are forced through this intricate pipeline system to the sulfur well some miles away. When the superheated water and the compressed air reach the mine, the superheated water flows down into the well, down some 1,000 feet until it reaches the sulfur-bearing deposit. Then it passes through the perforated end of the pipe into the sulfur bed. The melting point of sulfur is 240 degrees. Because its specific gravity is twice that of water, the sulfur separates immediately from the water instead of dissolving, and it starts to rise in the 3-inch middle pipe. Then the compressed air in the 1-inch pipe forces the melted sulfur to the surface. Downward flow the superheated water and compressed air, and upward comes the melted sulfur. Thus, by this ingenious method, sulfur is made available to world industry. But what becomes of the millions of gallons of water that have been pumped into the dome to melt the sulfur? To facilitate control of the water flow, wells called bleed water wells are drilled, and the water is drained back to the surface. This bleed water is treated to remove major impurities, then discharged into disposal ditches where, as salt water, it flows to the Gulf of Mexico. From the well, the melted sulfur flows directly to a relay collecting station such as this. And every day, from 5,000 to 7,000 tons of this yellow mineral flow into great sumps. Automatic meters accurately register the output of each well as the sulfur is discharged into the sumps. After being measured, the sulfur, still liquid, is piped to great storage mounds called vats. Here, first, corrugated metal siding is put in place to hold the sulfur before it solidifies. Then the liquid sulfur is distributed evenly in 1/8-inch layers, each layer being allowed to cool before the next is sprayed into place. Gradually, a huge block of sulfur is formed. Each block covers an area as large as 6 city blocks and as high as a 5-story building. Yes, large enough for 3 football fields with space between them. Dynamite is necessary to break up the immense sulfur block once it has solidified. Rotary rigs drill holes for the charges. The dynamite is lowered into the holes. The charges are tamped, and the primer is placed. And there she goes. After the blast, a bulldozer levels the surface. To facilitate loading the gondola cars, the tracks are moved as close as possible to the vat. Then the track-moving machine brings the tracks right up to the loading face of the vat. Huge clam buckets, capable of lifting 2 tons at each grab, load gondolas with the sulfur. Then on to the scale house, where each gondola is weighed on under-track scales. Should a car be light, additional sulfur is added, so that the contents of each car is exactly as ordered. Great trainloads of sulfur leave the mine. Some go directly to inland destinations. The remainder is sent by ship to domestic and foreign markets. The gondola cars are unloaded at port. Some are dumped into bins which hold 35,000 tons. These are kept loaded for emergency. Part of the mineral goes into giant hoppers, then to a continuous conveyor belt which carries 600 tons per hour. The sulfur is weighed twice on the belt in the weigh house seen in the background. After being weighed, the sulfur is poured through great spouts directly into the holds of waiting ships, which will transport it throughout the world. From the United States to the world at large. Sulfur, 3,500,000 gross tons produced each year. Over 20%, approximately 750,000 gross tons, is exported to foreign countries. The remainder, 2,750,000 gross tons, is used in the United States. Most of this is burned to make sulfuric acid, but the remainder supplies non-acid uses. To make wood pulp and paper, 325,000 tons. To make chemicals, plastics, sulfur drugs, dyes, carbon disulfide, carbon tetrachloride, refrigerants, and other chemical products, 200,000 tons. To vulcanize automobile tires, garden hose, the 1,001 rubber articles of everyday use, 50,000 tons. To keep insects from eating crops and fruits and rid cattle and sheep of lice, 75,000 tons. The non-acid uses of sulfur are then wood pulp and paper, 325,000 tons. Chemicals, 200,000 tons. Rubber products, 50,000 tons. Sprays and insecticides, 75,000 tons. Miscellaneous, including cement, gunpowder, synthetic rosins, and bleach, 100,000 tons. Total 750,000 tons. What about the remaining 2 million tons that are burned? They make sulfur dioxide, SO2, sulfur trioxide, SO3, sulfuric acid, H2SO4, sulfuric acid, the workhorse of industry. 30% of all sulfuric acid goes into the manufacture of fertilizers. To improve the quality of corn, wheat, oats, and other American crops. 15% for the manufacture of such chemicals as alum, salt cake, hydrochloric acid, and DDT. %13 for lubricating oils and gasoline. 12% to remove scale from steel and prepare it for galvanizing, tinning, and electroplating. 8% to make ammonium sulfate and coal tar derivatives from coke oven gases. Another 8% for rayon and other synthetic textiles. %7 in the preparation of paints and pigments. The remaining 7% in glycerin, pharmaceuticals, safety glass, storage batteries, woolen clothing, photographic films, synthetic rubber, shoes, water purification, alcohol, sugar, soap, and glue. The acid uses of sulfur, then, fertilizers, 30%. Chemicals, 15%. Oil refining, 13%. Metallurgical, 12%. Coal products, 8%. Rayon and other textiles, 8%. Paints and pigments, 7%. And miscellaneous, 7%. Total 100%, or 2 million gross tons. Of the 3.5 million tons of sulfur which the United States produces each year. Yes, this saffron mineral vital to life and living. This is the story of sulfur.
Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, and I'm at the entrance to Rip Van Winkle Gardens at Jefferson Island, outside of New Iberia, Louisiana. So it's a local tourist attraction and a magnet for picturesque weddings with pleasant gardens, a Victorian mansion, a nice restaurant, and a brick chimney sticking out of the lake. Wait a minute, there's a chimney sticking out of the lake? Of course, that chimney isn't there by accident. Well, it's actually there because of an accident. The accident, of course, occurred on the 20th of November 1980 when the salt dome beneath it was pierced by an oil drilling rig, causing a partial collapse of the salt dome and the eventual draining of the entire lake into the hole. So at the time, it was the largest man-made sinkhole in history and forever changed the geology and ecosystem of the lake. So in today's video, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the formation of the Jefferson Island salt dome, how salt was mined out of the salt dome, and how the lake disappeared. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Jefferson Island is one of a series of large salt domes that form a line across the central coast of Louisiana. So salt domes form when a piece of an ocean or a smaller sea gets cut off from its water supply and the water evaporates. What's left is a thick layer of salt. Now, over time, sediment layers of dirt cover the salt and compact into rock. So once enough rock layers are pushing down on the salt, a funny thing happens. The crystalline structure of salt molecules prevents it from getting compacted as much as the rock around it. So what this means that its density is actually less than the surrounding rock. And if you know anything about pouring different liquids into a cup, you know that the least dense substance then rises to the top. The same thing occurs here. The salt slowly works its way through a weak spot in the rock layers, and a salt dome is born. Salt domes exist all over the world, but here in South Louisiana, there's a massive formation of salt domes known as the Luan Salt. This salt originated from the Jurassic period, and there's over 500 salt domes below the surface of the state, with 5 that have pierced the surface and created a visible dome. In a line from northwest to southeast, there's Jefferson Island, where I'm at here, Avery Island, that's where Tabasco sauce is made, Weeks Island, Cote Blanche Island, and Belle Isle, which is southwest of Morgan City in the Atchafalaya River Delta. So you might be confused if you hear me refer to this place as Jefferson Island and then look on the map only to see that it's no island. That's because the term island actually refers to the fact that the salt dome rises above the surrounding landscape, which is only a few feet above sea level like an island. Avery Island is the tallest of these salt domes with a high point of about 150 feet or about 50 meters above sea level. Jefferson Island here is about 75 feet or 23 meters above sea level. Also, all but Jefferson Island are actually surrounded by marsh, yet because of their elevation, they have trees and wildlife, much like the surrounding places in the inland. So in another way, it makes them another bit of an island. It's an island of the inland in the middle of a marsh. The salt dome that creates Jefferson Island is relatively circular in shape with a diameter of 2 miles. So most of the salt dome actually resides underneath Lake Pigneer right here, which was most likely formed due to the land above the dome sinking over time. Before the disaster, it was extremely shallow across the entire lake with an average depth of anywhere from 3 to 6 feet, with the deepest portions of the lake not much deeper than your average swimming pool, so 12 to 15 feet deep. Jefferson Island has evidence of Pleistocene megafauna, including fossils of American mastodons as well as pure European native populations living in the area. European settlers came in the 1700s, and the location was known by several different names, including Cote Carline, Dupuy Island, Miller's Island, and Orange Island, until the land was purchased by one Joseph Jefferson, who made his career playing Rip Van Winkle in theaters worldwide. He built this giant Victorian mansion to serve as his hunting lodge, with plenty of famous people making their way over there, including former President Grover Cleveland, who apparently took plenty of naps underneath this tree. So during an attempt to drill a water well in 1895, salt was found approximately 334 feet or 101 meters below the surface, leading the owners to explore creating a salt mine like the ones already in operation at Avery Island and Weeks Island. So in 1919, the digging of the first mine shaft began, and mining operations started in 1922. The first level of the mine was 800 feet below the surface, and the salt rock was drilled and blasted into small enough pieces to remove. The salt was loaded into rail cars with electric shovels and then brought to a central area where it was then crushed and then placed into bins. Containers with a capacity of 5 tons then brought the salt to the surface, where it was loaded into shallow draft barges and brought down Bayou Carlin that drained the lake and flows into the Gulf of Mexico, which actually right around here is actually where the barges were loaded. Within a decade, over 200,000 tons of salt was mined from Jefferson Island, and by 1940, the mine was deep into about 1,000 feet or 330 meters below the surface. The mine was sold to Diamond Crystal in 1957, and they opened up mining operations 1,300 feet below the surface. By 1980, a fourth level, 1,500 feet or nearly 500 meters below the surface, was being mined for salt, with plans actually in place to begin a new level 1,800 feet down. The levels were mined in alternating patterns in order to keep the mine structurally sound, with large rooms that ranged in size from 65 feet square with a 90-foot ceiling at 800 feet to 240-foot squares with a ceiling of 75 feet at the 1,500-foot level. So in designing the 1,500-foot mining area, geotechnical consultants noted that the western edge of the salt dome was showing instability due to the more narrow pillars at the higher mining levels, and they figured this out because there was surface subsidence or sinking in places at rates of up to 10 inches or 25 centimeters per year. Salt dome domes form in places of weaknesses in sedimentary rock layers, which means at the fringes of salt domes you have fractures where the layers break. This is the perfect place for oil and natural gas deposits to collect and form small reservoirs. Before explorations to develop a salt mine had even begun, Belle Isle, for instance, had oil operations in place since the early 1900s. At Lake Pigneur, Texaco had a lease to perform explorations to see if there was oil to be extracted, and they hired Wilson Brothers, who was an local oil company, to drill exploratory wells on the lease. So there were two drilling rigs set up here at Lake Pigneur. So one was along the lake south shoreline and one that was in the lake known as P20. So P20 was set up on wooden pilings because the water in the area was far too shallow for a traditional offshore rig. So this had not actually been the first time oil drilling rigs had been set up on the lake itself. In fact, part of the contract with Texaco and the state was that in exchange for permission to drill, Texaco would have to remove the hundreds of wooden pilings that were sunk at the bottom of the lake. This was in order to make the lake more attractive to fishermen. So P20 was to investigate three possible formations where oil would be at. So at 3,000, 7,400, and 7,950 feet below the surface. So according to calculations, the drilling would be at its closest only 50 feet from the salt formation, which was well within regulations. The reason being is that the drill pipe was only about 14 inches in diameter. So if engineers found it necessary to move the rig to another hole, they could only do so along a 150-foot line running east to west. The reason being that any movement of the rig from north to south could actually pose a threat to puncturing the salt dome. The rig crew actually had experience drilling close to salt domes in the past, and the Wilson foreman on the rig after the accident stated in the report that there was really no reason to believe that he would even hit salt at all, and even if it did, it would be highly abnormal, and at worst it would just be a small pocket of salt that had separated from the dome itself. P20 began drilling on November 18, 1980, and on 4:40 a.m. on November 20th, on a clear morning just like this, they had drilled approximately 1,250 feet below the surface when suddenly the drill became stuck. Efforts to remove the drill placed strains of over 200,000 pounds on the rig, which really confused the crew because this was nowhere near normal for a stuck drill. The driller on the rig stated that he heard popping sounds below the rig. The crew also noticed shortly afterward that the rig was beginning to tilt. Within an hour though, the rig was evacuated and supporting barges were released from the platform because it had dropped 2 to 3 feet in one corner. Texaco officials had finally arrived at Lake Pigneur, and within minutes they were stunned to see the rig overturn and begin sinking beneath the surface at 7:25 a.m. This, of course, wasn't supposed to happen, as at the drilling site the water was less than 11 feet deep. Sometime between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m., an official from the mine met with the rig workers to inform them that the salt mine was beginning to flood. Down in the mine, the first sign that something was going wrong occurred at around 8:10 a.m. when Junius Gaddison, who was the master electrician at the mine, was in the electrical office at the 1,500-foot level. He heard an unusual banging noise, and so whenever he looked up, he saw a stream of muddy water approximately 2 feet deep flowing his way. The banging that he heard was actually the result of diesel fuel tanks banging into each other as they bobbed along in the water. Gaddison quickly shouted a warning of a leak, and the mine began an emergency evacuation. Over the next hour, the 52 workers as well as 3 visitors from LSU who were taking a tour of the mine were evacuated in textbook fashion. So one of the most amazing parts of this entire ordeal was that there were no fatalities, which really is a testament to the professionalism of the miners down in the mine, as well as the oil field workers on the P20 and nearby 35 rig. Once everyone was on the surface, Diamond Salt began the search for the cause of the flooding in the mine, and quickly surmised that the drilling rig must have had something to do with it. The precise location of P20 was determined just as the dragline was slipping below the surface, and calculations from this indicated that the rig did indeed pierce the mine. So as Texaco, Diamond Salt, and the U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration officials gathered to determine the cause and how best to handle what was going on, Lake Pigneur was beginning to show a scene of biblical proportions. The flooding in the mine became a torrent at the 1,300-foot level, creating a quarter-mile diameter whirlpool at the site of the drilling rig. Witnesses described the whirlpool as looking like a bathtub draining, with a tugboat, 11 barges, both Texaco drilling rigs, yes, even the one on land, going down the drain. By noon, the Delcombe Canal, or Bayou Carlin, actually reversed its course and began draining into the lake rather than flowing into the the Gulf of Mexico. The waters created a 160-foot or about 155-meter waterfall, which still to this day is the tallest waterfall the state has ever had, and that waterfall continued until the hole was eventually filled. So as though a quarter-mile whirlpool, a waterfall, an entire lake disappearing wasn't enough, there was one more surprise left in this from the mine. So what was happening is as the mine was being filled up, the air inside was being compressed, and it ended up being expelled through the main shaft and air shaft through the mine. So at about 1 p.m. there was a large bang, and a 400-foot geyser of mud and water flew out of the air shaft. It covered a 100-foot diameter circle in really fine silt. So the force of this explosion of air was so great that the lifting cage in the air shaft was actually mangled by the impact of the air. After a couple days, the Delcamp Canal slowly refilled as Lake Peigneur reached its normal surface level, with 9 of the 11 barges popping back up to the surface to be recovered at a later date. So Lake Peigneur was a freshwater lake before, but with all of the salt water from the canal and Vermilion Bay coming in, no, not the salt from the salt dome as sometimes stated in videos and documents online, the lake became more brackish in nature, which changed the ecosystem within it. So as a result, the lake also went from having its deepest point only being about 15 feet deep to over 200 feet or 65 meters deep at the site of the drilling rig where it punctured the salt dome. The partial collapse of the salt dome caused approximately 65 acres of land to be lost to the lake. At Rip Van Winkle Gardens, a home fell into the lake, leaving the iconic chimney sticking out of the water just off the shoreline. In addition, over 20 greenhouses at the neighboring Live Oak Gardens were destroyed as the land that they were sitting on fell into the lake as well. Seismic monitoring over several weeks showed that the breach in the salt dome had been filled and had been sealed actually through natural processes. The reason being is that the water deep below in the former mine was saturated with salt. So within days, both Diamond Salt and Texaco had both filed lawsuits against each other, with Live Oak Gardens suing both companies as well. So just before trial, all of the companies settled with each other. So Texaco and Wilson Drilling paid Diamond Crystal $45 million in damages since the mine was permanently closed, and $12.8 million to Live Oak Gardens for the loss of the property and materials. The federal government released a report on the disaster in August of 1981. So it didn't place any official blame because, well, you know, the evidence was flooded underground. However, the report did mention in its findings and its recommendations that in future instances, salt domes be better mapped and oil companies communicate better with mines when attempting drilling exploration near a salt dome. Unofficially, though, it seems that a mapping error may have been the initial cause of the disaster, as surveying data used to determine the placement of the oil rig was used with a different datum or a reference area of where latitude and longitude would be used to actually set up the rig. So the result was that the rig was drilling about 400 feet from where it was actually supposed to have been drilling according to the maps. So there you go, the Lake Peigneur disaster in a nutshell. It's amazing how something as tiny as a 14-inch drill pipe or a tiny surveying error could cause such a huge disaster. Yet here we are. There were so many amazing things that went on in this location. Now today, Lake Peigneur really is a great place to visit for locals and tourists alike. You can take in a slice of sportsman's paradise as well as seeing a
.4 Petroleum Geology. How is oil trapped underground? How are oil traps formed? A geologic environment that allows for economically significant amounts of oil and gas to accumulate underground is termed an oil trap. Several geologic structures may act as oil traps, but all have two basic conditions in common. 1. A porous permeable reservoir rock that will yield petroleum and natural gas in sufficient quantities to make drilling worthwhile. And 2. A cap rock, such as a shale, that is virtually impermeable to oil and gas. The cap rock blocks the upwardly mobile oil and gas, and keeps the hydrocarbons from escaping at the surface. One of the simplest traps is an anticline, a folded, up-arching series of sedimentary strata. As the strata are bent, the rising oil and gas collect at the apex, or top of the fold. Because of its lower density, the natural gas collects above the oil. Both rest upon the denser water that saturates the reservoir rock. One of the world's largest oil fields, El Nala in Saudi Arabia, is the result of an anticlinal trap, as is the famous Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Fault traps form when strata are displaced in such a manner as to bring a dipping reservoir rock into position opposite an impermeable bed. In this case, the upward migration of the oil and gas is halted where it encounters the fault. In the Gulf coastal plain region of the United States, important accumulations of oil occur in association with salt domes. Such areas have thick accumulations of sedimentary strata, including layers of rock salt. Salt occurring at great depths has been forced to rise in columns by the pressure of the overlying beds. These rising salt columns gradually deform the overlying strata. Because oil and gas migrate to the highest level possible, they accumulate in the upturned sandstone beds adjacent to the salt column. Yet another important geologic circumstance that may lead to significant accumulations of oil and gas is termed a stratigraphic trap. These oil-bearing structures result primarily from the original pattern of sedimentation, rather than the structural deformation. The stratigraphic trap exists because of a sloping bed of sandstone that thins to the point of disappearance. When the lid created by the caprock is punctured by drilling, the oil and natural gas, which are under pressure, migrate from the pore spaces of the reservoir rock to the drill hole. On rare occasions, when fluid pressure is great, it may force oil up the drill hole to the surface, causing a gusher or oil fountain at the surface. Usually, however, a pump is required to lift the oil out. A drill hole is not the only means by which oil and gas can escape from a trap. Traps can be broken by natural forces. For example, earth movements may create fractures that allow the hydrocarbons and fluids to escape. The older the rock strata, the greater the chance that deformation or erosion has affected a trap. Indeed, not all ages of rock yield oil and gas in the same proportions. The greatest production comes from the youngest rocks, those of Cenozoic age. Older Mesozoic rocks produce considerably less, followed by even smaller yields from the still older Paleozoic strata. There is virtually no oil produced from the most ancient rocks, those of Precambrian age.
Sulfur battery sent to me by a commenter. Thank you for that. The article is in Scientific Advances, which is an open access journal, so you can check it out. I'll put a link in the description. The first thing to understand is just how exactly a lithium sulfur battery works. The idea is that lithium metal is going to oxidize. It's going to lithium plus. Lithium plus is then going to move across the battery. On the other side of the battery, the sulfur cathode is going to accept those electrons and become sulfide, S2-. And that means that both electrodes are elemental, which means that there's potentially a ton of energy there, not a lot of filler necessarily. We'll come back to that. Now, the big problem with lithium sulfur batteries is what's called the sulfide shuttle, or the polysulfide shuttle. In most lithium electrolytes, they're not water, they're some sort of oily substance, because lithium reacts violently with water. And so they have to use something else. And generally, polysulfides, something like S8-, 2-, is going to be soluble in those kinds of solvents, and then it's going to diffuse. And if these polysulfides, S4, 5, 6, and up, can diffuse, they'll get across the battery and react. And that doesn't make electrons flow through the load, that doesn't make for a successful battery. And ultimately, a cake of lithium disulfide forms on the lithium electrode and really spoils it completely. So the polysulfide shuttle has been an area of research for decades now, trying to shut it down, trying to build a barrier that will keep all the sulfur on one side and just allow the lithium ions to go through, but still retain all the right properties for a rechargeable high density energy, an energy density. There is another failure mode for lithium sulfur batteries though, and that's what this particular paper is about. This paper is about the fact that you have to use a lot of filler in the sulfur side of the battery in order to get electrons through it. Sulfur is an insulator. So if you want electrons to go into the sulfur, you have to provide a path. That path might be something like a conductive carbon black. And getting that to play nice in that system is a bit of a trick. If the sulfur is dissolving and then depositing again, if the carbon is soaking up ions, then the whole thing is going to expand and contract. That expansion and contraction can ultimately destroy the battery physically, or destroy the barrier to the polysulfide shuttle, and the whole thing falls apart. So these great folks figured out how to prepare their electrode in such a way that they see very little of this volume expansion and contraction, and the electrode's much more stable. And thankfully the method is also a fairly benign method, doesn't require a lot of fancy processing and equipment or extremely high temperatures. So it's exciting stuff. I think that the lithium sulfur chemistry is pretty impressive, earth abundant kind of chemistry relative to some other lithium cells. Certainly sulfur is very cheap. One might hope that someday it could be a sodium sulfur chemistry instead, and that would be an amazingly inexpensive and high energy density cell. But we'll come back to some sodium-ion battery chemistry next week.
And distillation of plant material. A few things are necessary. One is the seclusion of the plant's form. Then a soft heat is applied in the form of steam, which raises the existent liquids from the material into an antechamber. The segments are identified. The choices from there. We might say the wheat is separated from the chaff in the antechamber, both figuratively and literally. In short, the plant matter is you, the physical aspects of your existence. The subtle heat of the steam is the applied contemplation that arouses all manner of thoughts into the antechamber of your mind. It lifts them above and with scrutiny categorizes them by their natures. One is a concentrated subject, the other loose. One is in short supply, the other more plentiful. One is worthwhile, and the remainder is rosewater. The process also demonstrates the experience of man as a condensed spiritual form, enwrapped in lesser fluids of greater mass, enwrapped further in lesser form being the physical matter of even greater mass. Anyways, this distillation is the process of understanding, and to grasp such, we need to begin an analysis of ourselves in terms of awareness, of what is us and not, or what is relevant and irrelevant. First, let's explain understanding. It is the application of our own faculty and Ima to reside within the second and third sphere. Ima, the mother, also known as understanding, is the first form of distinction. As it says of anything higher, there is no separation in them, and therefore there is little room for self-awareness. Thus the procession of time is moot, referencing apples from the orchard. I suspect some of you are asking why this is important, so let's take a look at the concept. The process of solve is the perfection of an item, a return to its roots, if you will. In the first video, this was described as the burning away of impurities in metals, taking them from their gross form into their beautified form with an applied change. However, this process actually describes beautifying the lower form to make it more ready for this particular ascension process. The idea goes like so. When we are tempered, when we are tried, when our superfluities are burnt up and beauty arises, we elevate above the dross. We are separated from the mundane things and brought up into greater purity. The human experience is gifted self-awareness of greater lengths at this point, until it reaches the breaking point, which is unity above and below, unity of all things, which we call. While you may have not picked up on it, this, being the beginning and final stage of self-awareness, is the end of the Tao that can be known. Everything beyond in unity is indistinguishable, and is therefore called Ain, nothingness, which is why it says there is a Tao that cannot be known, the eternal Tao, quoting the first lines of the Tao Te Ching. Thus it is here, the stone of the philosopher. So, to the common alchemist, we might question, what does sulfur have to do with this? What is the major active agent of all these things we've covered? I'd say, you, as in you are firstly, but is it not obvious? The brain. Sulfur, the principle of dissolution and separation, is the mind. More rightly, consciousness. It is liminal between form and unformed. It is the mediator between all things we actively engage with. It is the nature of Ima reflected into man himself. Understanding receives from above and below. It receives from supernal wisdom and from the lower via the obvious items, the senses. Man's nature is one of interaction, rather reception.
symbolic symbol. After the station, we'll find the dome, and at the end, we'll find the cathedral. It's divided into 3 naves. The nave of this is the natural state of the rock. You see, it's dark. To the other water and mixed with water and heated. With the heat, the water disappear and they go.
Hey.
Station, and on the right we have the church of Charlie. We have two kind of church. This is a small. In this level, they were doing one technique. The grass,
Hi, I'm Noah, and on this channel, I bring you with me to explore the hidden gems of China. I've been around the world, but where I am right now, nestled deep in the mountains of western Yunnan, is a place with a history and culture that is an unexplored gold mine. I have a friend, a former Chinese tour guide, and I asked him, where are your favorite ancient towns in China? And he gave me 2 places, both of which I'll be stopping on this 2022 Yunnan tour. So I've come out to the middle of nowhere in Dali's Yunlong County to find out what is Nuodong Ancient Village and what makes it so special. In the village itself, there are no roads, just a path of stone steps going up and down the mountain. As soon as I entered the village, looking up at these Martian red houses, contrasted against this otherworldly mountainous backdrop, I got an amazing feeling. The feeling that I've just encountered a whole new world that's waiting for me to explore it. One of my first great connections in Nuodong was my hotel owner. He was so nice he refused to let me carry my own suitcase up the hill. Having arrived and settled into my hotel, I was ready to dive headfirst into the history of Nuodong. This is the oldest historical village and earliest special economic zone in Yunnan province. 'Tis before Christ was born, this area has been coveted for one thing: salt.
它作为产盐以后呢，就是这里有柴，盐呢当时被誉为白银，这个地方有宝，大家都过来这个地方选宝。 然后就慢慢的落进这个山川里面。
And while plenty of salt remains in Nuodong today, the salt mining industry has faded away.
当时就是我们记忆的时候还在做盐，那时候村子里面就是有好多马帮，就是越盐越采燃料嘛，它的燃料都靠在附近方圆2公里左右的这些树木把它砍来，然后来做燃料。 拿来烧盐，然后后边就是96年以后呢，就是生态破坏非常大，然后呢就是把国家下令把这个盐矿封掉，不让开采，不让做盐了嘛。
Sitting along the mountaintop that evening, I met 2 fabulous new travel companions, Wang Rei and Su Mian. Wang Rei told me a story about how he heard the salt was discovered here in Nuodong.
传说啊，相传啊，就是在西汉的时候，可能是2000多年前，这边可能是有一个放盐的一个小孩，然后突然发现他的盐就是特别喜欢到那个有个地方啊，就是吃那个草，哎，他就过去看观察，然后突然会发现那个草边呢会有那个水冒出来，然后他就用手指蘸了一点，然后自己尝，哎，他发现非常的咸 ，salt，哎，他就回家告诉大人，然后大人过来一看，发现那个水就特别的咸。 然后后来就曝光了嘛，官府就过来就派一些专业人士啊，然后过来就是探查，然后发现，然后在旁边呢，他们就开了一口井，然后那个井水呢特别的比那个之前那个水啊就特别的咸，之前是在地表流淌的嘛，然后那个地下水就特别的咸。那么呢，官府就觉得，哎，可以用这些水去制盐，就是把那个水啊，它是卤水，然后通过加热蒸发，把水蒸发掉，然后呢，锅里啊就是那种盐渣了，然后把盐渣呢，然后那种工具啊把它磨碎，就可以做盐了。然后这些盐呢，可以销往全国各的其他地方，甚至销往东南亚、缅甸。那么呢，官府这样子的就会在这地方啊，就设置一个机构来管理这个盐，因为这个盐会进入中央政府的那个税收嘛，会贡献很多的税收。那么呢，这个地方就是慢慢的兴盛起来，因为有盐，然后有一些茶马古道。茶马古道是那些进藏的，他把茶给卖掉，然后他们过来是马，然后驮着盐再去到缅甸，去到其他地方。然后那么这边呢，就是形成了一个叫盐马古道，用马驮盐。
Having gained an understanding for Nuodong's so-called silver, the next morning I was after a different kind of treasure.
So me and my new friend, Sumian, we were walking along the road in the village and suddenly the road ended. It's just this like red clay path. We believe we have found the old Tea-Horse Road, Chayandao. It's first of all really beautiful just walking on top of these mountains here. To think of how many merchants must have been stepping on these exact footprints that I'm stepping on.
But this treasure hunt was the gift that just keeps on giving.
So we opened this small wooden door on the side of the hiking path and uncovered this seemingly hidden Taoist temple.
Down the hill, there was a special reward waiting for us after we finished our morning hike.
So I've just had the pleasure of being invited to this beautiful home for lunch with these just really down-to-earth people.
It was especially special because this was the moment when I got to try Nuodong's famous salted ham, the curing of which is an extremely complex process that takes at least 3 years. While chewing on this succulent pig, it seemed the depth and layers of flavor were never ending. Since they make the salted ham in-house, Uncle was able to fill me in more on the exact curing process.
骆驼的活的用这个骆驼原液，它就腌出来的。它里面骆驼盐这个还有钾元素，他们说那个钾元素在活体里面发酵以后，那个腌出来的活体质量特别好，香。特别香，还有这个肉豆的自然条件，我们这个腌这个活体就是被腌过以后就靠那个自然的风干，是吧？不用做任何的其他，是吧？
Feeling fully refueled, Wang Rei, Sumian, and I hiked to a nearby village to see what other gems we could dig up. Home in the village. The hosts were kind enough to let us look around. There's something about these homes here that feel more like a holy temple than a place to eat or sleep. The lighting of the homes is fascinating. You've got an open roof in the middle where most of the light enters, so the center of the house is very vibrant and bright. But then when you look in the corners of the house, they're all dark. On more than one occasion, I found locals in a dark room, with the only light they had being the fire used to cook food. The first image you usually see when you enter the home in the back between two sets of wooden stairs is an area where locals hang their sausages or salted hams. And then there's sometimes a study room, a space to keep books of one's ancestors and for children to study. My hotel owner showed us around his old home, now turned into an ecological museum. In his study room there was a guest journal.
Can you read?
Nuodong is a truly beautiful and authentic place. It's just a matter of time before this place becomes widely known by the rest.
At This is the most real ancient town I've visited. The buildings are completely authentic, and the people, both locals and visitors, are genuine and warm-hearted. And the place in its entirety is a cultural gold mine, or shall I say, salt mine. Throughout my 3 days